Have you ever thought about a winter so brutal that an entire family froze to death in a freezing cave in the Rocky Mountains? You know what's even scarier? They died just a few feet from their own fire. There was no war, no bloody enemy forces, or any big headlines in the newspapers. There was just a bone-chilling, indescribable, silent death. In the early 18th century, a group of people migrated west in search of a piece of freedom and a little land. They built cabins out of huge pine logs. They stocked up on food to last them for months. They confidently believed they were ready for anything. But nature shattered that belief, because when that mountain winter hit in its monstrous form, the temperature dropped to minus 30 degrees below zero. And from that moment on, the Rocky Mountains never forgave any human mistakes. This is not just a winter story. This is the history of that extreme moment, one that stretched the limits of human survival and the struggle for the human spirit.
In those days of the 18th century, the Rocky Mountains were not just mountains, they were a city of death. This place was not yet ready for human habitation. It was a primeval kingdom of stone, ice, and silent death. Every morning, the sun rose over the mountaintops, but there was no warmth in that sunlight. It was just a pale patch of light. The sky might have been a crystal blue, yet the air carried a chill that pierced every layer of clothing and went deep into the body, striking straight to the marrow of one's bones. Those who came here came with a dream, a piece of their own farmland, a sturdy wooden cabin built by their own hands, eternal freedom from the stifling noise of the city and the grid of rules. They knew life in the mountains would be difficult. They knew they would have to struggle, but they did not know that the mountain winter would show them exactly where human endurance and the struggle of the human spirit would break down. They began building the house before the summer heat had faded. Thick pine logs were chopped with axes, and walls were erected one after another. The gaps between the logs were carefully filled with mud and dry grass. A huge stone fireplace was placed in the very center of the house. That fireplace was not just a luxury or comfort. It was the last line of defense between survival and white death. The first snowfall began in late November. At first, it looked like heaven. Soft, white cotton snowflakes were falling from the sky. Children were reaching out their hands to catch the snow. Mothers stood in doorways and smiled softly at the gentle sight. But in the Rocky Mountains, beauty was a terrible trap. In early December, the temperature suddenly dropped far below zero. The daylight hours were shortened in the blink of an eye. The sun began to disappear behind the giant peaks of the mountains shortly after noon. At night, the wind blew over the mountains with a hungry roar, as if some primordial ghost was howling in the darkness. When the temperature dropped to minus 30 degrees, the air became poisonous. When you tried to breathe, your lungs would burn from the inside out. Your eyelids would freeze together like iron. If you took out your wet clothes, they would become as hard as an axe blade in a few minutes. Sleeping became the most dangerous job in the world. If for some reason the last spark in the fireplace went out, then that sleep would be the last sleep of your life, from which no one would ever wake up. So no one could sleep soundly in that bitter cold. One person would stay awake and guard the fire so that the flame would not go out. Then another would take his place. This silent watch would continue throughout each long night. They slept fully clothed, heavy boots on their feet. Their bodies were wrapped tightly in woolen coats. Despite all this caution, in the morning, it was seen that their breath vapor had accumulated inside the blankets, forming a thin layer of ice. Water barrels would burst like cannonballs under the intense pressure of the ice. Food would freeze and become hard as stone, which required a saw or an axe to cut. Snow would enter the house through even the slightest crack in the door, like a silent killer. As the winter deepened, the food reserves began to run out more and more dangerously. They had stored a lot of dried meat and potatoes, but no one had imagined that this winter would be so long and so merciless. Hunting became a nightmare. Wild animals seemed to have disappeared forever, as if the ground had been blown away. All around were miles and miles of endless white snow where there was no sign of life. If one step outside was wrong,
There was a fear of losing one's foot in a snow trap and disappearing forever. The food for the day came at one time, sometimes only half a ration. Sometimes they had to spend the night shivering, drinking only ice-cold water. The children's cheeks became pale and bloodless. They became lethargic. Their emaciated bodies did not even have the strength left to cry loudly due to the burning hunger. The mothers had stopped crying long ago because they understood that the salty tears of their eyes could not quench the fire of their stomachs. At that time, dry firewood had become more valuable than diamonds and jewels, but leaving the house to collect wood was like jumping straight into the face of death. A gigantic blizzard, a snowstorm, could start at any moment without any warning. The force of that gust of wind was enough to knock a man as big as a mountain to the ground in an instant. A young man went out to collect wood. He had grown up in this mountain. He was strong and indomitable, but the storm came suddenly and with great fury. He never returned.
2 days later, his body was recovered from under the snow. Half of his body was covered in frozen ice. His blue hands were still clutching the log he had wanted to bring home to his family. That day, every settler realized no one is safe here. Human courage is worthless in the face of the infinite power of nature. The deadly bite of winter was joined by all sorts of terrible diseases: pneumonia that shook the lungs, severe burning fever. The last breath of life was caught in a gurgling sound in the chest. There were no doctors, no healing medicine. Even a small wound or a common cold could be a sure death warrant. When someone died, it was impossible to bury them with honor, because the mountain soil had become as hard as granite under the influence of snow. Sometimes the bodies had to be carefully placed under a snowdrift outside the cabin, waiting for spring to come. It was a heartbreaking scene that would have shattered the hearts of even the strongest warriors, yet no one cried out. It seemed as if all the sorrows and sighs of humanity had frozen in the cold air and turned to stone forever. Despite all this, not everyone was wiped out. Those who somehow survived on the warmth of each other's bodies. The more people crowded together in the same room, the more life-giving body heat could be shared. At night, they would sit huddled together near the dying fire. They would whisper stories to each other, stories of the green grass and golden sunshine left behind, stories of those familiar faces on the busy city streets, stories of that beautiful future which they still held on to a thread of hope to see. These imaginary stories were what gave them strength and kept them from going crazy. January was the longest month in the history of the world. The night seemed like 1,000 years. The snow had built a wall as high as the door. To step outside meant death in a few seconds. One gloomy morning, when the fire in the middle of the house had gone out at some point, it turned out that an entire family had never woken up again. The exhausted mother, the loving father, and 2 small, innocent children in their arms. That day, no one in the village cried out, no one made a sound. They just silently, like criminals, poured some more firewood into the fireplace. Towards the end of February, a strange change suddenly took place in the mood of the mountains. The pale sunlight in the sky seemed to have begun to radiate a different kind of life. The air was still chillingly cold, but there was a faint scent of spring in that air. In March, the ice that had accumulated in the crevices of the mountains began to melt, and the black stone bodies began to peek out. The ice was melting, but those who survived that cursed winter were no longer the same people they had been. Words had disappeared from their mouths. A deep, heavy shadow had settled in the depths of their eyes. But deep within their hearts was born a silent, thunderous power that could never be understood in the comfortable life of the modern world. Many families left the Rocky Mountains forever with the first sunrise of that spring. They could not accept this merciless behavior of the mountains. The history of this winter in the Rocky Mountains is not the heroic story of a king or a huge army. It was an epic of extraordinary battles of ordinary people, a group of people who did not come to conquer nature, but simply to survive by enduring the extreme cruelty of nature. They did not conquer any gold mines or vast empires. They simply conquered another new sunrise at the end of each day. And that one sunrise was the biggest and best victory of their lives.